stranger.
Greetings, friends, and welcome to episode 56 of the Innsmouth Book Club. And as you can see tonight, we've brought you straight to the back room of the Esoteric Order of Dagon. Yes, once again, we're braving the hall because we've got a special panel show this time for you. I'm one of your hosts, Rob Poyton.
I'm the other one, Tim Mendes. And yeah, we'll be joined by two esteemed guests. And we'll be talking about class and society and all kinds of other bits and pieces in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Our guests are John Houlihan and David Hambling. Hi, guys. How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks.
Hi. Pretty good.
Yeah, thanks for coming in. I know you've both braved Innsmouth before, so this is like, it's a breeze now, I guess. Even in the EOD, it's,
Yeah, it's very comfortable in here as well. You can put your feet up.
It's always nice and warm.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, just don't ask what they're burning to keep it warm.
So really how this episode came about was over lockdown especially. I started listening to a lot of Tolkien podcasts, some very good ones, including the Prancing Pony podcast is very good. But one thing I noticed is they were largely American. In fact, I think all of them that I was listening to was American. And they covered a lot of aspects of Tolkien, but I kind of thought they were missing out on some things. So I thought it would be nice to get some perspectives on Tolkien and Lord of the Rings in particular from the English point of view, because I think there's a lot in there that you might miss if you're not brought up with that sort of outlook. So that's basically where we're going tonight. And I thought maybe for a start, if we could just give a quick introduction of ourselves and maybe how we got into Tolkien and broadly what we think about Tolkien, just to start off. So maybe, David, you want to start us off with that?
I first read Tolkien as a teenager back in a different century, and like everyone else was completely entranced by his world building and his breadth of vision and the sweep of the thing. And I found it instantly engaging. I mean, looking back at it now, it looks much more of its time than it did then, because I think it bears a lot of the hallmarks of English attitudes of Tolkien's era. Hopefully we can get into a few of these things. But I think people these days may not appreciate some of the nuance, not just because they're American, but also because they are from another time. Because all this stuff of people speaking in cut glass accents and respect for nobility just doesn't exist anymore.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
How about you, John?
Well, I was trying to remember, and I think I probably read The Hobbit when I was very young, or at least listened to it. The first time I kind of remember anything about Tolkien was my junior school, when I think we were being read to, with The Hobbit was being read to us. And I was like, this is a bit boring. I've done this. I'm already on Lord of the Rings. And I thought, let's keep up. And but yeah, I see Tolkien, in literary terms as just the kind of founding fantasy author. I think one of the, he had the Circle of the Inklings and stuff, but he's the one that has just, exerted the most influence, I think, on modern fantasy. Back when I started reading Tolkien, he was very much a niche pick. It was stoners maybe at university, had, concept albums from various but I think probably the thing that's propelled him to the foremost, become the foremost influence on fantasy has been Peter Jackson's films, because they have been just so huge and such an influence on modern fantasy writing.
Yeah.
Oh, could I just throw in another word there? Dungeons and Dragons.
Yes, of course.
Yes, I did want to mention that at some point as well.
Which is Tolkien-esque as anything.
Yeah.
And I mean, I guess you could even throw in Warhammer as well, from a particularly British perspective, in terms of role playing. That was the guy. They changed orcs to have a K in it just for copyright issues. But it's basically a wholesale rip, and I think quite a lot of fantasy is based upon Tolkien's kind of structure of orcs and dwarves and elves and humans. People taking obviously lots of different directions, but he's the sort of myth of or creationist of all that kind of thing.
Tim?
Yeah, I very similar. I read it. I read The Hobbit first when I think I was in juniors, and he was my dad. So he was because my dad was a big hairy biker bloke, and well into his prog and all of his 60s psychedelia and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, so I sort of got into it by osmosis really. I read The Hobbit, and then I got the Lord of the Ring, Fellowship of the Ring. I remember getting it out from Macclesfield Library when I had to, when I was very, very small. But yeah, and then from there, like you're saying about the Dungeons and Dragons and things like that, I next encountered it in the age of the ZX Spectrum, because I had the Hobbit text adventure and the Lord of the Rings text adventure.
Wow.
Yeah. So they were kind of my thing, because I was a major geek when I was that age. I still am. I don't know what I'm talking about, but a big gamer even back then. And yeah, so that was it for me. I was kind of hooked then. And the books almost became secondary after that point.
Well, the games give you a way of living in that world, don't they? They
exactly.
give you an extension of it.
Yeah,
I totally agree with that. And again, along similar lines, I think The Hobbit was a very young age. I remember at the time I was very much into reading things like Alan Garner and those kind of books, so it fitted in with that. And then Lord of the Rings was probably about the same time as I started tabletop wargaming. When I went to senior school, there was a club that was just being formed there. And the two things that were played the most was Second World War, because obviously Sven Hassel and that kind of stuff. And some of the older guys, I guess they must have been minifigs, miniatures of a balrog and Ithilien Rangers and that kind of stuff. So we started doing sort of tabletop Middle-earth battles. And that even prompted me to try and read the Silmarillion at one point, which
yeah, I attempted that. I think I've attempted
I kind
it
of
twice.
got through some of it, I think. Yeah. And then, of course, sort of 77, 78, D&D hit, and there was a whole other world opened up. And I think for me, it was those two things. It was Robert E. Howard and Tolkien were the two touchstone authors that provided all the background for that kind of thing.
The two very remote poles, you might say.
Yes, kind of opposite poles almost, I think. Yeah. That might be an interesting thing to touch on as we talk as well. Well, it would be interesting. The thing is with Tolkien is there's no crossovers, is there? Because we know with Lovecraft we can do anything we want with Lovecraft's creations. The Tolkien estate is a little bit more sort of litigious, I think.
Which is why they had to remove the hobbits from D&D and turn them into halflings in the later editions.
Yeah.
Got a question, Rob, about your tabletop, the Balrog.
Yes.
Did it or did it not have wings?
The big minifigs figure, I should have dug it out, shouldn't I? I've still got it. It did have wings. It was basically like a big demon kind of thing. So it must have been about a sort of 60, 75 mil figure, perhaps. And it had wings and a whip in one hand and a flaming sword in the other. The flaming sword broke off at some point. But
I know. I had the original minifigs figure on that, which was only 25 mil, and it did not have wings. So I actually added some to it.
Oh, right.
Excellent. See, I thought we'd start with a bit of controversy,
Maybe that wasn't a minifigs figure then, that one. I think the Ithilien Rangers...
No, it sounds like it was, but that may have been a later one when D&D rolled along.
Because then we started getting Raoul Parther and all those kind of figures as well coming out. I think most of the time before that we were using sort of historical figures. Yeah. So sort of Anglo-Saxons for Rohirrim and that kind of stuff, with the odd fantasy thing.
Did that.
Yeah. So I thought we'd start with landscape, because I think it's very easy and very obvious to fit the Shire into England, or the Shire as England. One thing that I found, it was actually quite nice, say during lockdown, I started taking up cycling. I put my bike out the shed, and during the summer especially, I'd take long cycle rides. And I live in Bedfordshire, leafy lanes, nice hills and woods. And at the time I was listening to the Prancing Pony podcast, particularly the Fellowship of the Ring section and all those chapters set in the Shire. And the two just dovetailed very nicely for me. So what do we think of the Shire as England, and what does that say about Tolkien's view of England, do you think?
Well, I actually came across a reference where Tolkien said that the Shire was a Warwickshire village in about 1897, so the era of Queen Victoria's Jubilee. And that's interesting because he would have been just about 5 or something at the time. So his land of lost content is inevitably the wonderful world of his childhood, back when everything was simple and summers were hot and winters were snowy and it was all cozy and comfortable. So I think that fits right in. And also because he's put it in a later historical era. The Shire is quite anachronistic with its mills and its people smoking pipes and potatoes and the rest of it. So it's a much more comfortable setting than any actual medieval village, which would have been quite nightmarish.
Yeah, I think I saw a very interesting documentary on Tolkien's early life recently, and I think it echoes that perfectly. It's a child's eye view of England. I think at that stage he was wandering around those woods. I think he had a brother, and they were constant companions, and they were just literally out all day, making up their own games, sticks for swords, and wandering around these woods, and possibly peopling them with their own imaginations and stuff. And I think you're absolutely right. I think it's a very kind of childlike conception of a perfect England, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. I think you've nailed it there, because there's no working, there's no ploughing, there's no slaughtering of animals. It's all just picturesque countryside.
There's not even really much of a government, is there? Because I think you have there's the mayor, who's basically the postmaster and presides at fairs. And there's a few sheriffs, I think. I think there's a few, 3 sheriffs in every farthing or something like that. And that's it. There's no king. There's no government at all. Yeah.
Well, there's a thane, but yeah, there doesn't seem to be any government as such. Hobbits just don't do that kind of thing, do they? They are like children. Everything just happens somewhere, and life continues on its sweet way.
Farmer Maggot is the only guy who seems to work, right? And he's his carrots.
It is that very, very much that sort of when you're a kid and then very small British villages where everybody knows everybody. I mean, there's one down the road from everywhere you are, isn't there, really? If you look hard enough, there's all these tiny little insular villages that don't seem to have been touched by time or progress. And I guess that's kind of the whole thing. It was like these untouched places because you've got progress just down the road, which obviously when he was growing up, that would have been the Black Country and all the rest of it. You've got the march of industrialization, which was kind of a threat to, this kind of cozy little British life, this village sort of ideal. And I guess, it is kind of that whole thing of wanting to hold on to these memories and things not to change,
Yeah. And isn't it interesting how that setup, on the one hand, that can be idyllic, this sort of little detached place where, nothing really happens. On the other hand, you've got Royston Vasey,
this is
it seems to be one extreme or the other.
But Tolkien is definitely on the rural idyll side of that. But it's a constant thing. The threat of industrialization, you see it everywhere. Wherever the bad guys are, there is industry, there is smoke, and cutting down of trees. So you see it in Mordor, you see it in Isengard, and you see it in the scouring of the Shire. This is where the industrial era comes to the Shire. For some reason, they suddenly feel a need to put up chimneys and burn all the trees.
Yeah, no, I lived in the Black Country for a long time. And even to this day, it's not healed. These vast swathes of these old slag heaps that they've all been sort of like reclaimed by nature to a degree, but it's just weeds. There's nothing built on them. It's all just wasteland.
And that is absolutely symptomatic of Mordor, isn't it? With the slag hills are so big, the entire Allied army can gather on them.
And I think that's one thing that really, comes through in Lord of the Rings is the sort of power of nature and the really sort of healing power that has. Middle Earth itself is almost an idyll. And I do remember there's a very interesting quote from Tolkien saying, I can't quite remember the exact wording, but it's something like, no one speaks for the trees, but I'm determined that I'm going to speak for the trees. And hence we have Treebeard, a guardian of a threatened forest.
Nice.
One of the most interesting characters as well. I think Treebeard's great.
Yeah, definitely.
You can definitely see that Tolkien feels that natural world equals good, and that's the natural state for humans to be in is pre-industrial, not industrial or post-industrial.
Yeah.
Right, natural, but not too natural. It's natural up to his level of water mills,
yes,
and village pubs.
Yeah, it's not totally wild, is it? It's not a Robert E. Howard barbarism situation.
No.
We raise our little fingers when we drink tea, kind of thing, isn't it?
Yeah. It is the countryside of rose-covered cottages.
Yeah.
What I find really interesting as well is, amidst all this, is that there's no religion.
There's not really any mention of temples or anything, is there, in the whole book? I don't think.
Now, in terms for the hobbits, I mean, as ideal.
But even across the book as a whole, there's very little idea of religion in a formal sense.
No, that's true.
I mean, I suspect part of this is because the whole thing is kind of a religious fable, and also you sort of suspect, because Tolkien was quite considerably religious himself. I don't think he liked the idea of creating a pagan religion, so I think he left it vague. But the gods are definitely out there, and they do play a part.
Yeah.
I mean, you see it in the Silmarillion, all the sort of underpinning, but it's very much in the background, isn't it? In Lord of the Rings, we don't really get any formal kind of.
There are gods, but there is not much religion.
Yeah.
So he's more creating the mythology than the actual religious basis.
And I think as well that natural or nature element we sort of spoke about was probably a big part of Tolkien's boom in popularity in the 60s, which I guess is when the paperbacks first came out. Or I think in America they were issued not quite with permission or something, weren't they? The first edition, but it seemed to tie in very much with the hippie thing of the time. And I think with the English psychedelic scene and people like Syd Barrett, that was very much a more sort of rural, harkening back to almost Edwardian times. I mean, do we have parallels there with things like Wind in the Willows, Piper at the Gates of Dawn? These things seem to tie in together quite nicely.
Yes, exactly. I think with Wind in the Willows, they could be living next door to Hobbiton, couldn't they?
Yeah.
It's the same sort of gentle English adventuring style. But then, with a bit of mysticism thrown in.
Yeah, now every time I read it, I'm gonna hear like Grantchester Meadow or something like that from Floyd's first album. I'm gonna hear it in my head. The gnome.
That's always the one for me. A little man.
Yeah.
So this takes us nicely into the next subject then, because Wind in the Willows, we've got Toad of Toad Hall and all the rest of them. They seem to be on the same social level as all our characters in Lord of the Rings, at least. Well, with one exception, they're all quite well-to-do chaps, aren't they?
Yeah.
But they are unbelievably well-to-do chaps. I mean, if you look at the Fellowship of the Ring, you've got Aragorn, who's a prince, obviously. Boromir, who is a quasi-prince, obviously. Legolas, his dad is King of Mirkwood, so he's a prince. And Gimli is actually something like third cousin to the king, so he's royal blood as well.
Yeah.
And then you've got and the hobbits are, they are gentry rather than aristocracy. But I think, is it Merry's dad is Thane of the Shire?
He is, it's Thane. Yeah.
And Pippin's is one of the masters of Buckland. So they are definitely up there in the squirearchy. And Bilbo doesn't have any great status, but he seems to be the richest person around, which seems to give him a position, and Frodo is his heir, is therefore up there. So those three are all, just below the nobility, and with the princes above them. And then you've got this one character right at the bottom, the gardener.
Yep. Of course, he's a manual labourer. There we go.
Token working class.
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to put something out here that might be, I don't know how popular it is, because generally when they have polls on these podcasts, so they talk about them, Sam often comes out as the most popular character, and I think even Tolkien described him as the emotional heart of the book. For me, is my least favorite character.
Yeah, I'm not.
And I actually think the emotional heart of the book is Smeagol, Gollum, who's a much more interesting character.
Yeah, I'd agree. Yeah,
it's just the cap doffing aspect.
Right, sir. Yeah.
Forelock tugging.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Yes, Mr. Frodo.
Well, I think it's because he constantly calls him Master Frodo, doesn't it? I think it reinforces that, he's better than Sam.
Mm-hmm.
He's
but back in the day, that would have been not just acceptable but normal.
It's true.
And there is, for him, there is this. That is perhaps the idealized version of the class system in England at the time. That you have the retainers are brave and loyal and jolly good chaps and know their place. And they have their wise master who makes all the decisions and has all the money and tells them what to do and looks after them. And you have this great bond between the two, but there is absolutely no way they're equals. And I think that's where modern readers and modern viewers might struggle a bit with it, because the two guys are, on the face of it, equal, but certainly not in the social system of the time.
And would that also kind of be reflected in Tolkien's army experiences, where you have this officer class,
exactly,
professionals, educated and trained to be leaders of men, and then the conscripts, who were the working class guys, the boys, brigades who signed up together, sometimes from the same factory, sometimes from the same mine. And it would be a very similar kind of, led by the upper classes, but the foot soldiers are lower classes, working classes.
I think there's something in Tolkien's letters that directly addresses that. I think at one point he talks about the stout English yeoman, the brave Tommy, and that kind of stuff. But I think there's another letter where he was barracked somewhere overnight, and he was with the rougher type of chap, and he complained about the bad language and the drinking and that kind of stuff, which to me then that directly relates into the orcs. And it kind of feels to me like the Sam is the rural working chap, and then the urban working class are all filthy, dirty, sweary.
You're right. You're absolutely right. They are working class soldiers who swear and fight and generally make trouble and are well beyond the pale.
Yeah, definitely. Unless they're Welsh, and then they'll be down a mine.
So Moria, you think, would be the Welsh orcs.
And kind of spoil everywhere they go as well, right? Mordor's.
Yeah.
Oh yes, of course, because they deface everything, and there's graffiti and all that, and filth in inverted commas wherever they go, isn't there? So
definitely working class. Whereas the elves clearly beautify everywhere they go and add intricate carvings and decoration, whereas the orcs just destroy everything. I think we know who's who there.
Definitely.
I don't think there's any working class elves in there. The elves are noble by nature, and they're all certainly honorary upper class, whereas the orcs are necessarily all lower class.
Yeah,
because even when you see the orc officers like Grishnak or those kind of, they're in charge of quite a big unit. So I presume they're like captains or something like that, and they're still exactly the same class, aren't they, as the rest of them? They're not posh orcs, are they?
Well, it is that difference between the officer class and your joined up fellas, because they could only get as high as like sergeant, wasn't it, or something back then? And the officer class, they were born into it and all this kind of thing, and that be essentially.
In theory, you get officer training, but essentially, you're if you're a good yeoman, you're NCO material.
So I guess the orcish sort of leaders would be like the RSM or something, shouting their orders and getting them marching up and down the square and all that kind of stuff. And then obviously the elves would be the well-heeled officer class, sort of pouncing around in the mess with their their glasses of brandy, and all that kind of stuff.
I don't think this has been challenged anywhere in subsequent media either, has it? Because the orcs are always always,
Cockneys.
Yeah.
But that's something that totally struck me, even as a kid reading The Hobbit, and I think I wrote about this in one of my essays, was that they get to the trolls. The trolls are all called Bert, Harry.
Bert and Harry. Yeah.
I had
exactly.
I had an Uncle Bert. My granddad's name was Harry.
I had an
They're all
Uncle
like,
Bert.
yeah, go on, blimey. I mean, they're almost talking apples and pears, right? And I'm reading this and thinking, hang on. I think it's a bit strange here.
Now, then again, you see, you've got Smaug, though, who is also one of the villains, but he's posh because he's a dragon and he's got a ton of gold.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, I was thinking about Smaug earlier. He's a very interesting character, and there's a very famous, again, a famous Tolkien quote about those who, it's better to look for good cheer and good companionship and good beer rather than pursue wealth and worldly power. In The Hobbit, Smaug is obviously the hoarder of great wealth. I mean, I don't think by any stretch Tolkien was a class warrior, but he could see there's certainly perhaps a symbol there that certain aristocracy maybe are hoarding the wealth for themselves, maybe.
Well, I think to be fair for him, he wasn't so big on colonialism. I mean, there are a couple of quotes. I love England, but not Great Britain, and certainly not the Commonwealth. And British and American imperialism in the Far East fills me with disgust. And he also said things like, I have the hatred of apartheid in my bones. So there's these sort of contradictions as well. You might expect him to be a big flag waver for the empire, but he seemed to be quite anti-colonialism. And again, in some of the writings where Numenor tries to take over other countries, that becomes part of their fall. That's them on the sort of path to evil.
Yeah, he is what would traditionally be called a Little Englander, which is this non-imperial version of Englishness, which just wants to sit and watch the sunset on the village green with a pint of beer.
Yeah, definitely.
Rather than tramping to glory across 2/3 of the world or whatever.
Yeah, that quote was, if more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world. It's difficult to disagree sometimes.
Nice.
And so ironic, really, that he should have become far and away the wealthiest deceased author in the world.
Well, indeed.
Yeah.
Yes. I gather he lived a fairly modest lifestyle. Well, I suppose he must have... a lot of it was published during his lifetime. The Silmarillion was after, I guess. But he must have been financially comfortably well off in his lifetime. But he seems to have been quite a modest man in that sense.
Yes, absolutely. Class, you see.
But that's that English thing, isn't it? And I've known, having lived out in some rural areas, you bump into someone who's quite literally got string for a belt.
Yep.
Filthy old tweed jacket on and all the rest of it. And someone else will say, do you know who that is? Do you know who that is?
Yep.
he owns like half of Cambridgeshire, that guy, And it's that sort of upwardly mobile middle or upper middle class are the ones who have got all the flash and all the bling. So in that sense, I suppose that is a very English thing as well.
Definitely.
I think he was a very committed academic as well, wasn't he? I've a couple of times I've been to Oxford, and you can walk past his house, and it's a very modest kind of suburban sort of house, and I think he probably found most of his value in academia, really.
So coming in alongside that class issue, we have this idea of bloodlines, because as David mentioned, everyone's a prince or similar, and it's very much this idea like the right bloodline has to take over. You have to be of the right stock in order to be in charge. What do we think about that?
Absolutely. I mean, back in Tolkien's day, people did used to talk about breeding.
Yes.
Which is something that just doesn't exist anymore. And this idea of royal blood and superiority by means of birth. And in Middle-earth, that he makes that absolutely literal, because Aragorn really does have special blood. He really is, because he's not like the rest of us. I think he's about 87 during the events in the book, and he has 3 times the lifespan of any normal human being. So clearly, he is a very special person. and chosen by. And this, I think, you see a lot of it through. There's an awful lot of genealogy in Lord of the Rings, and people tracing back their ancestries, which is clearly a direct link to the English class system.
And I think a great irony of it is that Tolkien was a great champion of Anglo-Saxon culture in particular, and he hated 1066. He used to speak about it in almost quite personal terms. And yet, if you look at English society even now, it's the Norman families, the Mandevilles and the Percys and the Darcys, who are still by and large in places of power. Those bloodlines are still there.
Yeah.
Yet Tolkien was kind of against them.
Which is, yeah, I mean, it's interesting because the Anglo-Saxons bloodline wasn't necessarily how the king got chosen. You did have a council who would discuss it. And if the heir apparent was clearly a useless lump, they did not get made king. Whereas in Tolkien, clearly everyone who is a king is absolutely born to it and is absolutely deserving.
Yeah.
I mean, and we see this particularly with the struggle between Aragorn on the one side, who is the rightful true king, and Boromir and his family, who are the pretenders. And obviously it's Boromir is the one who succumbs to the power of the ring, and Aragorn who comes out smelling of roses.
And even Denethor, right, who submits to despair, and well, he kills himself in the end, I guess, doesn't he? Which is again,
definitely sign of not king material.
Yeah, not quite up to the job. Yeah.
When the king's restored, kind of Faramir, he sort of settles back to his rightful place, doesn't he? And sort of reinforcing it further.
Yeah. But there is also this thing that royalty are supposed to have magic powers. I don't know if you've heard, there's this horrible disease called scrofula, which is tuberculosis of the neck, which used to be called the king's evil, because supposedly the way it could be cured was by the royal touch. And back in the day, you did get kings going around touching hundreds of people in order to cure them of that. And that didn't stop until George I. And we see the exact parallel in Lord of the Rings, because there is this ancient tradition that the hands of the king are the hands of a healer, and that is how you will know them. And goodness me, if Aragorn doesn't turn up with healing powers, and in the houses of the healing works his magic. So something which is just a curious legend in our world is absolute reality in his, and it shows that the person who is born to be king is special and favoured by the gods. And what's interesting in the English class system is that that's the foundation for the whole thing. God sits at the top of it. The king is the one who is immediately underneath God and God's representative on earth. And then the rest of it feeds up through the aristocracy and the gentry up to that. So everything is ordained by God. And if you disagree with the system, then you are challenging the entire natural order of things. And I think that does come across quite strongly in Tolkien.
Absolutely. The divine right of kings, isn't it? I guess.
Yes.
Yeah, the king, King Charles will be King de Gratia, king by the grace of God. And this, because of that, you see, when you get crowned, you don't get crowned in the palace, you get crowned in a cathedral, and you get crowned by God's representative, which would be the Archbishop of Canterbury. So when Aragorn gets crowned, who crowns him?
Gandalf, isn't it?
It's Gandalf.
Yeah.
It is Gandalf, because Gandalf is the direct representative of the god who's actually been sent by the gods.
Yeah, true. Because in effect, Gandalf and Saruman and the rest are almost sort of like angels in a sense, aren't they?
Yeah. Or archbishops, as the CV would have it.
Yes.
I was going to say there are some royals who still go around touching a lot of people, but perhaps we best not go there.
Yeah, but you see, that doesn't fit with the scheme, so you just couldn't have that. I mean, I suppose you could have a corrupt royal in Middle Earth, but they would definitely be a baddie.
Well, saying that, you did have Saruman, a corrupt bishop by all accounts. So.
Yeah, indeed. Or a fallen angel.
Fallen angel is kind of where I was going with it. He's kind of Middle Earth's Lucifer, isn't he?
Well, we do get that sense of temptation, I mean, with the ring itself, and I think again more in the Silmarillion, some of the backstories that corrupting power, perhaps,
Well, the Nazgul, you know.
Yeah, the Nazgul and the Numenorians are of good stock, but they obviously some of those turn to bad ways as well. So again, there is that aspect, but you do get the overriding sense. I think it was Michael Moorcock famously said it, wasn't it? It's the same people in charge, you know.
Yes,
Absolutely.
Have you ever read The Last Ring Bearer?
No.
It's a very interesting novel. Russian guy, I think. Oh, what's his name?
Oh, this is yes.
It tells a story of Lord of the Rings from Mordor's perspective.
Oh wow.
Nice.
Yeah, it's a very interesting book. It has its faults, let's say that, but it's very interesting. You know, from their perspective, Sauron's the one that's coming in and giving them work and giving them a purpose. And you know, when the elves come in to sort of after the fall of the Dark Lord, the elves come in and they're very much, you know, the harsh enforcers. And there's a few orc characters and there's a few sort of human characters as well from the evil men. But it's an interesting counterpoint to you know, exactly that sort of royal hierarchy and the divine right of kings to rule.
And geographically, it makes perfect sense. You know, Mordor off there in the east is Russia, and this. I mean, that book is supposedly why the Russian soldiers are called orcs by the Ukrainians, because they associate them with having Mordor as their side.
Yeah, interesting. Oh, I didn't know that. That's interesting. Yeah, it's a little while since I've read it, but I do remember thinking this is quite entertaining.
And I suppose in a way, this is the difficulty in that sense, is that you can't write Tolkien from a different perspective because you can't write Tolkien.
Yes.
You know? Again, I know we come back to Lovecraft and the big open sandbox that we all can play in. So we get all those different perspectives on deep ones or whatever.
Unless you're Amazon.
Unless you're, oh, no.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
So...
And you've got a spare billion quid.
I was going to say, if you've got like bags of money, yeah, maybe.
If any of you guys had a spare billion, would you do that with it, or would you be?
No, absolutely not. Because even if you made something that was really good, you'd still get slated for it by a lot of the fandom.
Well, there is that. There is that.
You know, you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. If you make something, you know, how dare you? If you don't make something, how dare you? So it's best just to not bother, I think.
Do you think, though, that any of the adaptations capture that sense of Englishness? I mean, the only one I can think of is the BBC radio version, which I think does, perhaps, but I'm not sure about the others.
I think, like, the early scenes in The Lord of the Rings in the Shire, I mean, I think that does, but the rest of it doesn't. And maybe certain scenes here and there do, but I think the bit in the pub does, because I've lived down the West Country. That is like a Devon. That is like going to the pub in Devon, you know.
Yes, I think that's certainly a pretty good go. Yeah. But Hollywood is never quite going to do that because Hollywood doesn't like the class setting. It certainly doesn't like the race setting. I think so. It's never going to get quite close to what Tolkien was about.
It's all too clean. You know?
There's not enough. There's not a romance. Well, there is romance, but not in that Hollywood film sense, is there? Really?
No.
And maybe not enough action in some sense. I don't know. I think maybe the problem is with Lord of the Rings. The difficulty is presenting that story, given the huge amount of background and depth there is to it, and without having to have little subtitles up that says, "Oh, well, actually, Thranduil was the king of Mirkwood," you see, and you know how do you get around a lot of that stuff?
Yeah, I was upset that you didn't get a scene from the fox's point of view. Has anybody explained why that? Because it's completely incongruous in the rest of the books. You've just got this one scene from the perspective of a fox.
It's quite strange, isn't it? Yeah.
I just thought maybe it was Tolkien had a couple that night. It was like, I'm going to write this scene, this chapter from the perspective of a fox.
But that's almost back to your Wind in the Willows thing, right? You know.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Anthropomorphized animals, in tweed.
And one thing that is never covered in any adaptation, as far as I know, and how does this fit into this Englishness, is Tom Bombadil. What's going on there?
That's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, he's difficult. He's an English nature spirit, isn't he? But he doesn't even fit into Tolkien's schema, really.
Yeah, I don't think anyone even tried. I can't remember the Ralph Bakshi version. Was he in that? I don't think he.
No, because we covered that.
No, obviously they had to shorten it, and he was such an obvious one to cut.
And I suppose, to be fair, from a narrative point of view, you've got all this thing moving along, and then suddenly you get 3 days hey foldy roly and all that kind of stuff.
But I mean, the guy is straight out of a folk club. He really is. The spirit of a certain rural Englishness that is supposed to underlie everything and endure everything. And you get a sense of timelessness, that he will always be there, whatever is happening in the rest of the world. But in no sort of movie or visual medium can you make any sense of him, really, unless you're going to try. The only way to do that would be to integrate him into the plot in some way, which is not what he's there for. He's not there as a plot device. He's not there to give some information or any revelatory insight. He's just there because Tolkien liked him. I'm not sure if anyone else does.
It's a divisive character, I think.
I've kind of see it as Middle Earth's rambling Sid Rumpo, really.
Yes.
I knew you were going to get that in.
You do, yeah.
Also, if they were going to get someone to play him on the film in a movie, it would be Ian Anderson from Jethro Tull.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Spot on. Yeah.
Standing on one leg with his flute. Yeah,
totally. And
isn't he a salmon farmer now? Something like that.
I imagine he owns a few salmon farms and a few million acres.
For a little while, I think that will fall apart.
A trout tickler, I imagine. but I think it is a shame, because then when that character goes, then we miss out all the Barrow White stuff as well, which I think was a very English thing.
Yes,
and I think one thing that Tolkien doesn't get credit for quite often is the horror aspects of his writing.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking the Barrow Wrights. I'm thinking Barry Whites. The Barrow Whites, Shelob's Lair, the Dead Marshes, the Mines of Moria. There's some really great horror set pieces in there as well.
Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, because you've got 2 bits in the Tom Bombadil. You've got the Barrow Downs and the Barrows, which are kind of this misty, lurking, ancient and slightly evil side of it, and then you've also got the Willow, which is, I don't know whether that's a rogue ent or what. He never really bothered tidying that up. But there's this idea that these ancient trees can also have a dark side to them.
I think the Barrow Downs episode as well, when you think of the amount of ancient monuments we've got in this country, and it's almost straight out of that, and a very imaginative use of how, what might lurk in those ones. Again, maybe going back to his childhood.
Well, wasn't that the first Conan adventure?
Yeah. The first published one was the Phoenix on the Sword, I think. But I don't know which was the first.
Because I thought the first one I remember reading, and which I thought was the first published one, well, it basically involves the Barrow Downs scenario of Conan going into a barrow and finding a long dead king who inconveniently resurrects and has a go at him.
Yes.
The thing in the crypt.
Yes. Yeah.
That is an early story. I'm not sure if that's a Elsprague de Camp pastiche though, or a rewrite or something. But yeah, it was in one of the first paperbacks, I think.
Yes, yeah. And you see, the English are much more understated. It's not the I'll hack at it approach. It's more you need Tom Bombadil or some other ancient force to rescue you.
Yeah.
Obviously, you've got M.R. James's Warning to the Curious as well.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that comes back because that's where they get the ancient sword, right? Or swords, sting, and all those things come from that old treasure. So again, that's that link to a much deeper past. It's not just a monster in a crypt or an undead thing. There's this whole backstory even behind that episode as well.
Of lost kingdoms underneath our feet.
And because in a sense, Middle Earth is, we've spoken about this with Clark Ashton Smith, a lot of his stories, it's a decaying civilization. This is a place at the end of its tenure almost. Things are running down. Large parts of it are abandoned and empty. There's a lot of ruins around.
Yeah.
I mean, and this is a very
Absolutely,
small
yeah.
c conservative view of England. It was always better in the past. We're always looking back to the ancient days of glory, whether it's King Arthur
Yeah.
and Robin Hood or Queen Victoria or our finest hour. It's all very much backwards looking and saying, aren't things terrible these days? Which I don't know whether other countries have that quite so much.
It does. There seems to be a peculiarly English sort of wistfulness, doesn't there? Which you know,
Yeah. It's like we're born with inbuilt rose-tinted glasses for them summers when you were a child, you know. Is
You might argue that America is built on being forward-looking, believing that the future is going to be wonderful, and that the past we were living in log cabins, and that's something we're moving away from down the highway. Whereas in Britain, we're always very nostalgic for our old cottages with no central heating and no electricity. Yeah.
And the slums.
We were happy in them days.
We were poor, but we were happy. Yeah.
outside loo down Battlemead Garden.
But then America seems to have that frontier kind of attitude, or the Western thing, doesn't it? Harkening back to when days were simpler and we all live in those little communities, unless you're in sort of Salem, perhaps. Or something like that.
Yes, I mean, I think they could tap into that, but it's the medieval past, or Merry England is much more of a romantic scene than that. But yeah,
do you think that's why a lot of the Americans will hold on to whatever ancestry they've got, whether it be Irish, German? Do you think that's because they haven't really got that over there? So they'll say, "Well, I'm of English stock," so you know, so they look at that for the sort of that nostalgic look, maybe.
I guess it could be they want to hold on to those roots. Yeah,
everyone likes to have a romanticized ancestor they can cling to. It's like the number of people in this country who are proud to be descended from Vikings.
Yes, yeah. Have you noticed when everybody has these like past life regressions? Nobody was just Bert who like packed sausages down at the Bert the troll who made sausages down the factory down the road, you know,
out of hobbits. Yes,
out of hobbits. Yeah, they were always like some warrior or King Arthur's mate or something, you know.
Cleopatra seems to be quite a favourite as well.
Is it? All right.
Speaking of the past, then, just to wrap up, because I think another thing we need to touch on, not necessarily a uniquely English experience, but certainly from Tolkien's perspective, is World War One and how we think that influenced the book. I do have another opinion that might be, I don't want to be disrespectful for this one, but I think it's something that needs asking. Tolkien obviously experienced it all firsthand and all the horrors, and he must have come across people suffering from shell shock and similar. Is there something about the character of Smeagol that comes from that, do you think?
Yeah.
He's obviously a very damaged individual.
But I guess like you had all those poor souls in places like Bedlam, and a lot of those were suffering, maybe not just for like wartime, things like that, but a lot of them were like sufferers of abuse or people just with mental health problems, you know. So I don't know whether that was kind of a reflection of just in general, you know, these people with struggles and problems and all that. I don't know. It's interesting. I've never really thought about it like that.
I mean, certainly you can draw broad parallels about a world that's being plunged into a massive war, which is just, as it goes along, is sucking everything into it. Because in a sense, the War of the Ring is a world war, because it stretches all the way across the map of Middle Earth. And it's not just a localized thing around Mordor. It stretches out, and in the end, it gets as far as the Shire. But it's also, you know, in Moria, in Mirkwood, Dol Guldur, everywhere is touched by this. And I think that's perhaps the World War aspect of it. And it is a grimy and bloody experience. I don't know if there's any quite parallel to trench warfare in there, but I don't know what Tolkien's own experiences were like.
Yeah, it was at the Somme, wasn't he? I think he was at the Battle of the Somme.
Yeah.
But I think, I mean, certainly in terms of landscape, you can picture that in some places. And also, I will say there is that touching scene with Sam where he sees the dead, is it the Harad soldier or something? And he goes through that thing. Oh, what brought this guy here? He's just like me. Did he really want to come and fight? You know, that seemed quite a real moment, if I can put it in those terms.
Yes. I mean, I suppose you could also see the progression from the green fields of the Shire. You get on your troop ship, you travel through the fine city of Gondor or Paris on your way to the front line, which is this completely blasted landscape that you find when you get to outside Mordor.
Yeah.
So I think it's paralleling the experience there quite neatly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably definitely true. You know, some of the things he saw and experienced definitely influenced his perspective on war. But the War of the Ring is a war of liberation, isn't it? At the end, you know, evil is vanquished. There's a new beginning. The four hobbits come back from it completely changed. And maybe there's some, you know, parallels there. They're definitely very different people at the end than they are from the beginning. Their experience is lost. They've fought and, you know, experienced lost themselves. You know, Frodo famously the finger, and you know, maybe there's something in that. But I think you know, maybe the War of the Ring is a war which has a happy ending, in as much as these things ever do. In that order is restored, the land is back, but it changes everyone who has fought in that war, and maybe that's the kind of. I don't think there's necessarily any direct parallels between Tolkien's experiences and Lord of the Rings, but it's a different kind of war to the First World War, I'd say. You know, which is horrendous loss, and you know, as I guess Tolkien would come to realise, you know, all for it all to happen all over again.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. Sadly, yeah.
Actually, if you're looking for another World War I parallel, which has just occurred to me since you mentioned it, the you know, coming across strange weapons like the Black Breath, which is a gas attack.
Ah, yes, of
which
course. Yeah.
nobody is ready for, which leaves everyone in the area disabled afterwards and in need of healing. Yeah. So it's again that sense of coming across fearful, terrifying, and weaponry that you can't avoid. Perhaps that's also a World War I echo.
I suppose the other scene really that is reminiscent of it is when they cross the Dead Marches.
Yeah.
You have all the bodies underwater and stuff. I think maybe that.
Yes, exactly. That could almost be a French landscape, couldn't it?
Yeah.
No man's land.
And then, of course, Mordor itself, which is blasted and earlier.
Excellent. Well, I can hear the shuffle of feet coming in next door, and I think the chanting and organ playing is going to start in a minute. So it's time for us to depart, because no one wants to be in the EOD once the rituals begin. You might never leave.
As soon as the Hierophant whips his organ out, then you've got to get out quick.
It's time to go.
We know it's time to go.
So, chaps, just before we go, have you got any projects or anything lined up at the moment you'd like to tell us about? David, you got anything in the pipeline?
I have just finished and submitted a story, but I can't tell you about the anthology that it's part of. But watch this space.
Excellent. John?
Just releasing Forest of Fear, which is a new RPG book with Modiphius, and putting the finishing touches to the Dubois Escapades Volume 3, Keeper of the Hidden Flame, which is the first part of a new Gaston Dubois Napoleonic Cthulhu adventure.
Awesome.
Hopefully in the new year, it won't be too long in the new year before I publish that, I hope.
Excellent.
Yeah, good stuff.
And Tim, you've got the Shadow over Doggerland is out now, I think.
Indeed, yeah. It came out the other day. That's the first part in the North Sea trilogy. And that's 15 tales of Lovecraftian and Smithian horror on the fabled, now sunken landscape of Doggerland. So, yeah. It features some bloke called Poyton in there as well, doesn't it?
He gets everywhere.
He does.
Everywhere. Yeah.
He does.
Brilliant. Thanks. Nice to see you guys. Thanks for
Thanks,
coming
man.
in.
No worries. Well, great.
Take care.
Always. That was a good chat. I really enjoyed that.
That's brilliant. Thanks ever so much. Good fun.
All right, folks. So we will be taking our leave shortly. The bus has arrived outside. As I say, we don't want to hang around here for too long with all that going on next door. And it does mean that this episode, we don't get to view Dagon's sack, because obviously that is currently next door, where it forms the centre point of the ritual currently in progress. So we'll have to wait till next time to dip into Dagon's sack. But we have had some correspondence in, I believe, Tim.
Indeed, yeah, we had a nice little missive from Aaron Vlek on YouTube regarding episode 55, our interview with Mr. Davenport. He goes, nice. I especially liked Mr. Davenport's words on HPL, encouraging us all to write in his world. It makes HPL seem like a mentor to writers he has inspired, and is in truth a progenitor to his own League of Spawn. Great show, and I really appreciate the reliable release of episodes. So yeah, cheers for that. That's brilliant. Nice.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. We try and be as regular as we can, given the conditions sometimes in Innsmouth. It can be a bit of a challenge, but yeah. So very much appreciate that. And Aaron is one of our patrons, of course, and I just want to say welcome to a couple of new patrons. That's Rob Weaver and David A. Riley. Thank you, chaps, and welcome aboard. If you'd like to join them and help to support the show, take a look at our Patreon site. When you sign up, you get access to bonus content for not only the Innsmouth Book Club, but also Strange Shadows. You get a monthly copy of Innsmouth News. And we're looking at tweaking next year some of our other rewards as well. Let us know what you'd be interested in, whether you're an existing patron or you're thinking about signing up. Would you like to come on the show and have a chat with us? We can look at doing some more merchandise perhaps. So do let us know. All right, so next time, I believe we're going to be outside. We're going to Innsmouth Cemetery, is that right?
Indeed, we're going to be braving the cold night Innsmouth air for a very special episode. It's another special, this time on the classic English ghost story. We'll be joined by some special guests. We're going to make sure they're all wearing their thermal undercrackers. And
can I bring a hip flask?
Oh, I was going to say hip flasks are mandatory. Definitely,
and
definitely.
I think a pipe perhaps as well, given
yes.
We're going to be in Jamesian territory, aren't we?
Oh, we are indeed, yeah. I'll try and get some of the good stuff off Zadok Allen to put in our hip flasks.
All right, so a big thanks again to our guests today, David Hambling and John Houlihan. Of course, we'll put the links up to them in the show notes below. And with that, it's goodbye from me, Rob Hoyton.
And it's goodbye from me, Tim Mendes.